So the Pentheus story in the Metamorphoses comes as part of a sequence of stories about myths connected to the city of Thebes, which itself is the subject of a lot of different Greek tragedies. So before we've come to this part of the Metamorphoses, we've already been primed, as it were, to be thinking about Greek tragedy. With Pentheus in particular, the most obvious tragedy for us to think about is Euripides' Bacchae. In this tragedy, the essential plot is the same as what Ovid gives us. We have a situation where people worshipping Bacchus have come to Thebes. Pentheus, as king of Thebes, is anxious about this, thinks that it's he doesn't like the form that the worship takes because it's sort of wild and abandoned and jumping about on the hillside, suckling fawns, and odd stuff like that. But he's also, in his defence, concerned that this might be an act of impiety, because to worship a god who isn't actually a god would anger the other gods. So there's this debate about whether or not Dionysus actually really is a god. In Euripides' play, what happens is that Dionysus himself comes to Pentheus in disguise and essentially kind of does a mixture of warning him not to be a sort of basically not to be stupid and to accept that Bacchus or Dionysus is really a god, but at the same time also kind of tempting him into saying things and doing things which are going to lead to his own destruction. And there's this sort of famously chilling scene in the play where Dionysus has already been turning Pentheus mad and starts dressing him up as a woman in order to send him out on the hillside so that he can go and see the women who are engaging in the Bacchanalia at close quarters. And that's the point at which Pentheus is seen by his mother and aunts, and they mistake him for an animal and rip him to pieces, which is nice. So we got this kind of the overarching story of Euripides' tragedy is very much there, and some of the details within Ovid's portrayal are there as well. Most obviously, probably at the opening of this section, we have Tiresias, the prophet, turning up and saying to Pentheus, be careful, you know, don't be stupid and deny a god who is really a god. And this in some ways anyway echoes kind of similar sentiments voiced by Tiresias as a character in Euripides' play. But even there, we're already getting points of difference, because whereas Tiresias in general in tragedy is associated with sort of telling people the future, but in a way that the audience can understand but the person on stage generally doesn't quite get. So it's slightly obscure, slightly riddling kind of speech that he gives. In Ovid, Tiresias sort of starts off in that kind of way, by and it with slightly more oblique description, and also with this idea of kind of warning Pentheus, don't do this or it's going to end up in a nasty mess. But by the end of his speech, he actually ends up saying, well, do you know what is going to happen anyway? So we get very much more this kind of playing around with the idea of tragic inevitability, that Tiresias ends up telling us exactly what is going to happen, which indeed does happen. However, as we go on through the story, we don't get exactly what happened in Euripides' play happening in Ovid's version. Most notably, I suppose, is that this man Acoites turns up, who isn't a character from Euripides' play. There's a sense in which the way he turns up makes us think of Dionysus appearing in disguise to Pentheus in Thebes in Euripides, but that's never made explicit. And even to this day, critics differ on whether or not we're supposed to see the figure of Acoites as actually Bacchus in disguise, or not at all, just a completely different figure. Either way, he comes along and he tells a story of how Bacchus has turned sailors into dolphins after they tried to kidnap him and sell him for ransom. And this is a story which is not from Euripides, but from the Homeric hymn to Dionysus. So this sort of very kind of obvious transplantation, if you like, of a different literary source right into the middle of the Pentheus story in the Metamorphoses. And then we kind of revert to something which is a little bit more like Euripides, but again with some of the kind of important details left out. So whereas in Euripides it's Dionysus who tempts Pentheus into going out on the hillside, in Ovid he just goes, and then his mother sees him and rips him to pieces, and the story finishes in fairly short order. I mean, we get a kind of nice gruesome description of his arms being torn off, but then it's the end of the book, and that's done, that's finished.